Thank you so much, and thanks to the Virginia Forage and Grasslands Council for having me. It has been such a pleasure to travel across your beautiful state over the past week, and it's just been a wonderful experience. I have learned so much hanging out with Johnny and JB and Peter in the van. I learned all about toxic fescue this morning, and I have a favorite forage plant, hairy vetch. Who cannot love hairy vetch? So, I mean, that just sounds so awesome. So I hope that some of you all are wondering, and if you're not wondering, maybe you should be, if Peter's right and the science says all that he says that it says, why do our dietary guidelines and our dietary policies say that we need to essentially reduce, if not eliminate, animal products from our diet? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, about that disconnect between science and policy. And I'm going to start here, back in the 70s. Now, you can laugh at our fashion choices and you can laugh at our hairstyles, but back in the 70s, we weren't fat as a nation. So what happened? And this is the big question that got me interested. So although I wasn't even born yet, I remember the 70s pretty clearly. And I remember that we didn't talk about food the way that we talk about food now. There weren't these big categories of good foods that good people eat and bad foods that bad people eat. I mean, when I was growing up, there were a few food rules. Sugar will rot your teeth. Don't snack before dinner. Don't swim after eating. And if my neighbor Kimberly's mom is cooking it, it's good food, and if my mom's cooking it, it's bad food. And that was about it. We just did not have all these food rules. So I started off at UNC Chapel Hill, down the road from NC State, studying nutrition epidemiology. In fact, I believe that's what it says in your program. Epidemiology is a big word that means the study of disease in populations. And we do things like this. So this is a pretend graph of the Townsville population, and it tracks gastroenteritis in the population. Now, if you're an epidemiologist, you look at that graph and you go, something really interesting happened right in the middle there. Let's see if I get my little laser pointer to work. Something changed. And if you're an epidemiologist, you want to know what happened. Well, how about this? If this happened, we installed a new water treatment plant. Well, does that mean that that water treatment plant caused that rise in gastroenteritis? Not necessarily, but it sure is an interesting question to ask. Well, over there at UNC, what I got interested in is this. This is a graph of the percent of the population that are overweight or obese. And you can see that back there in the 70s, the number was way down. And then something happened. And that's what interested me. So as an epidemiology student, I wanted to know what happened right there. What changed? Here's what changed. We created these dietary goals for Americans that told people what they should be eating to prevent chronic disease and what they should not be eating to prevent chronic disease. And of course, at the top of that list were animal products, particularly red meat. And one of the reasons that I'm no longer at UNC Chapel Hill, and no, it's not because I didn't have to go to classes and they just gave me credits anyway, is they didn't want me asking this question. They didn't want me to investigate whether or not there was an actual relationship. Again, like I said, I wasn't saying that the guidelines, that the goals caused the obesity crisis, but I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Let's see if there's a relationship. And they said, no, thank you, Adele. You may not ask that question here. And so I went right on down the road to NC State, and they said, sure, you can ask it here. Because, according to Tom Vilsack, The science behind our guidelines is unquestioned. Well, what I found out at UNC, that means we don't want you to question it. That's what they mean by unquestioned. But like Peter pointed out, what it really means is there isn't any science there to question. The dietary patterns in our guidelines have not actually been tested for health benefits. And I realized from the gentleman that I've been traveling with that you guys aren't used to that kind of science in agriculture. You're used to rigorous experimental science that tells you what you should do based on actual trials. That's just not how we do it in nutrition and nutrition policy. So that's what I'm going to point out to you today. And if you don't take anything else away from this talk, I want you to understand that policy does not equal science. I know that you've heard this before. This is particularly true in nutrition policy. Science tries to tell us what is, how the world works. We go out, we experiment. If our experimental results don't match up with our hypotheses, we have to change our hypotheses. We have to change our guesses. And we keep doing that in science until we get closer and closer and closer and closer to what is, in fact, true. Science can always be changed. We can always go, oh, we've got a better guess now. We've got a guess that better matches our experimental outcomes. Policy doesn't work like that. In fact, policy and science are like oil and water. They just don't even mix very well. In policy, we like to tell people not what is, but what should be, what we think should be. We like to tell people what to do. And that's not the same as what is. And policy, unlike science, when there's a big fat mistake, it doesn't change. There's too much vested interest, too much money, too much ego, too much ideology sunk into keeping the policy the way that it is, so it doesn't change. So we're going to climb in the Wayback Machine and talk about the history of the guidelines and find out how we got in this mess that we're in. I like to call the history of the dietary guidelines fixing public health until it breaks since 1977, because we were doing just fine before. We were eating diets that were about 55% fat and protein. The majority of our calories came from animal products. Now you might have heard that if we would all just go back to eating fruits and vegetables, we could end this obesity crisis. Well, back in the 50s, when there was no obesity crisis, only about 10% of our calories came from fruits and vegetables. About a quarter of our calories came from grain products, and the rest of it came from animal products. And yet, we weren't obese. And in fact, we valued animal products so much that during the wars, this was part of our public service messages, we wanted the folks back home to eat fish and vegetables so that we could send wheat, meat, and fats to the troops. Now, did we want to send meat and fats to the troops so we could give them all heart disease? No. It was because we thought then that meat and fat was nutritious. And if you were paying attention to Peter's presentation, you understand now that they are. But now, even though there's no reason to ration them, the dietary guidelines want us all to be on a fish and vegetable diet, even though we don't have troops to send meat and fats to. And why is that? Why should we all be eating fish and vegetables? The simple fact is that our diets have changed radically within the last 50 years. With great and often very harmful effects on our health, too much fat, too much sugar or salt can be and are linked directly to heart disease, cancer, obesity, and stroke, among other killer diseases. No, this is not Michelle Obama. It's this guy, George McGovern, back in 1977 at the press conference introducing the dietary goals for Americans. He's posing there with piles of fat to illustrate how much fat the Americans were eating then. So the first thing that we have to question is, in 1977, was there in fact an epidemic of killer diseases that necessitated George McGovern and his Senate committee coming forward and telling us all how to eat? Well, here's our epidemic of killer diseases. Heart disease and stroke, in fact, had been going down for about 15 years before the dietary goals ever came out. In fact, ever since the Surgeon General's report on smoking, Americans had reduced their rates of smoking and heart disease and stroke gone down. So does that look like an epidemic about to happen? You already saw how much obesity there was in the population, not nearly as much as there is now, and adult onset diabetes was virtually unheard of. Because it's not about the science, it's about the story. And this guy had a really good story. This is Ancel Keys. You may have heard his name. He was the guy who brought us the diet heart hypotheses. And if you've ever heard the story about the drunk looking for his keys under the streetlight, not because that's where he lost them, but because that's where the light is, that was Ancel Keys' approach to heart disease. He found out he could measure the cholesterol in your blood, and he figured, well, I can measure it. Let me see if I can connect it to any disease. And the disease that he ended up connecting it to was heart disease. And so the American Heart Association gave him a national platform from which to spread his message that cholesterol in your blood leads to heart disease, and the way that you get high cholesterol levels in your blood is from eating animal products. That's the story. That's a guess, as Peter called it. But it was a good story to these folks. So coming out of the 1960s into the 70s, way back when we used to call them hippies, now we call them the counterculture. The counterculture folks like this story that reducing our intake of animal products would reduce obesity and disease. And they thought that was a good story because it fit in with the rest of their story. That their story went like this, that animals, raising animals to eat took away food from people who are hungry. So we're putting grain into cattle, and we should be feeding it to the hungry. Another part of their story was that these animals that we're raising destroy the environment, and therefore, by reducing our intake of animal products, we're also saving the planet. So their story went like this. Not only can reducing your intake of animal products reduce your risk of obesity and disease, it can save the planet and feed the hungry. And that story fit in with this story. So back in the 70s, Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon. There were problems with inflation and rising food prices, and in order to address that, his background, he had a lot of ties to agribusiness. So granted, we were trying to lower food prices, but his way of addressing that was by saying, let's increase production and let's just get government out of the way. So unfettered production. And so hedgerow to hedgerow planting, big monoculture crops, lots of corn, lots of soy. And the vegetarian counterculture folks hate it when I point this out, but their agenda fit right in with big agribusiness. Because now we've got all these grains and all these cereals for the food supply. What doesn't go into cattle can go into humans. I heard somebody mention high fructose corn syrup. So we had all this corn, all this soy. We're going to figure out how to get it into the humans if we can't get it into cows. And even back in the 70s, the farmers were already going, what are we going to do with all this corn that's going to go into cows that you're telling people not to eat? And we figured it out. We just feed it to people. And so that's what happened. In the 1977 dietary goals, the McGovern Senate Select Committee essentially took the ideas that were in Diet for a Small Planet, which, by the way, is high-protein meatless cooking, and they took the ideas and the ideology, they took the story, and they created a Senate report. Now, how many of you have read a Senate report lately? There you go. This Senate report was widely read. In fact, they had to, they ran out of the first printing, they had to print it again. It was essentially a bestseller. They were on the Today Show, they were written up in the New York Times, they were in Newsweek, they were in Time Magazine. This was a huge event in America. Why? Because it's a good story. What's the story here? The story is, if you want to be a good citizen and you want to protect your health and protect the planet and feed the hungry, all you have to do is go shopping. And Americans love to be told that we can fix everything by going shopping. All you have to do is go in your grocery store, walk past the meat counter, and pick up some fat-free yogurt, and you will have saved the planet, fed the hungry, and protected yourself from heart disease. That was the story, and we bought it hook, line, and sinker. So the government went from telling us what we should eat in order to be healthy. And this is how we did it back in the 70s. I don't know if you guys remember way back when there were the 4 food groups. I think this is a little bit earlier in the 70s, so there's more than 4. You had the dairy group, the bread and cereal group, the fruit and vegetable group, and the meat group. And you were supposed to eat a little bit from each group every day. And I remember in grade school being so thrilled because a pepperoni pizza had one from every food group on it. That made pizza health food. And in fact, as long as your pizza has meat on it, it is. The government went from telling us what to eat to what not to eat. And this is when things really changed. Instead of telling us what we should eat in order to get adequate nutrition, it was going to tell us what not to eat in order to protect ourselves from disease. So we were to decrease our consumption of animal fats in particular because those things had saturated fat and those things had cholesterol. So we were to avoid red meat, butterfat, whole milk, eggs. The nutritionists and the nutrition scientists at the time thought that this was just a complete mistake. A nutritional debacle is what they called it. And their primary reason was that the goals came from incomplete evidence, that there really was no evidence out there, despite what Ancel Keys had to say, that animal fats were causing heart disease. And they said, look, McGovern, you can look at your own Senate report, and the evidence in your report contradicts your conclusions. This is from the 1977 Senate report, and it shows what our levels of animal fats and levels of vegetable oils were in the diet. And they pointed out, their story was that from the 1950s to the 1970s, an increase in animal fats was causing this epidemic of heart disease. Well, do you see an increase in animal fats? There's an increase in vegetable oil. There's a decrease in animal fats. So their evidence didn't make sense. But starting a long, proud tradition of how dietary guidelines get made, they take the evidence that's in front of them and they make it say whatever they think the conclusion should be in the first place. So not only did they complain about the science, but nutritionists and public health folks also said, we can't give out these guidelines because there is no one-size-fits-all for the population. There's no one dietary pattern that's going to be right for everybody. And this is what I learned from driving around in the van with the guys, is that there's not, just like there's not one forage mix that's going to be right for every environment, every field, every animal population. You have to change things up to meet your particular needs. The same is true of diet. And they also said these dietary modifications are not harmless. You cannot guarantee that telling people to eat this way is not going to cause an increased risk of other disease. But that didn't stop us from going ahead and taking these guidelines and beginning to change the way that we ate and change the way that food was manufactured and influencing our thinking about what we call healthy food. And I think you need to know that the policy itself has been essentially an historical accident. So we like to think that policy that's so influential, like the dietary guidelines, is something that's been carefully thought out. But the policy started off as a Senate report, not a group of scientists, not nutritionists, a bunch of guys who wanted to make the world a better place. And they meant well. I truly think that they did. It started off as a Senate report. That same year, the Farm Bill made the USDA the lead in nutrition. So that put essentially the power for making nutrition recommendations in the hands of the USDA. But there was still no policy mandate. There were no official guidelines. In 1980, the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services made some guidelines, essentially a brochure. But again, there were no scientists overseeing this, and there was no mandate. There was no policy or no law. That same year, the Institute of Medicine came out with their own set of guidelines that completely contradicted the ones that the USDA came out with. So this was the other side of the story. The folks at the Institute of Medicine were saying, you know, yeah, you should probably not eat too much, and sugar's not good for you. A lot of fat probably is not good for you either. But telling people to quit eating animal products in order to avoid heart disease, we don't have that kind of data. And so, of course, the rest of the folks in the government are like, we can't tell the public this. It'll confuse them. And so there was a lot of debate about what we're going to do. In the meantime, the USDA and Health and Human Services issued another set of guidelines, again, not mandated, no legal basis for this. Finally, in '87, because the controversy continued, the scientists this whole time are saying, this is a mistake, this is a mistake. So finally, in '87, they created legislation that said we need to get some scientists to actually review these guidelines. And that's when they came up with the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. This is the group of scientists that are supposed to review them. Health and Human Services came out with another set of guidelines. They were reviewed by scientists, but what the guidelines say at this point is, because we understand that there's already a public health message that's been taken up by the public, and we don't want to confuse them, we're just going to maintain the same public health message. The legislation to create official dietary guidelines didn't occur until late 1990. 1995 guidelines are the first ones that are officially mandated by law. And the reason that they happened in 1990, after a decade worth of issuing guidelines to Americans with no legal mandate behind them, is because the scientists and the public health folks looked around in 1990 and they said, wait a minute, what's happening? Americans are getting fat. We've been telling them for a decade to lower the fat in their diet, to lower the cholesterol in their diet, to quit eating animal products. And strangely enough, it looks like they did. And everybody went out and bought athletic shoes and started jogging. How come we're fatter now than we were 10 years ago? Well, they must not be getting enough dietary advice. And so they made the dietary guidelines official. What were the consequences? Now, anytime there's policy created, there are intended consequences and there are unintended consequences. When they created prohibition, there were intended consequences. Yes, did it decrease people's drinking? It did. certainly at first. But there were unintended consequences. Rise of organized crime. So when you create a policy, you have effects that you intend and effects that you don't intend. And when we started telling people what to eat and what not to eat, there were consequences. And if you hear people say, the reason that the dietary guidelines don't work or the reason that a low-fat diet doesn't work is because Americans don't follow it. Well, when we gave the public the dietary guidelines, we essentially chose winners and losers in the food supply. And you guys know who the losers were, right? That'll tell you right there. We told Americans to quit eating red meat, and they did. We told them to eat more flour and cereal products, and they did. We told Americans to quit eating eggs, butter, lard, and tallow, and they did. We told them to consume more vegetable oils because those were healthy, and they did. They told us to quit drinking whole milk and to start drinking skim milk, and we did. They told us to eat more fruits and vegetables, and we did. The increase in fruits and vegetables during the obesity crisis tells us we're eating more, not less, of these things. Changes in the food supply helped us to follow those food rules that we were given. So when you hear that red meat is the cause of the increases in disease in our population, note that the flour and cereal products, the increase in calories from flour and cereal products and vegetable oils between 1970 and 2008 is about 400 calories. The increase in calories from meat is less than 20. So the food supply changed. It changed in the direction of what they were telling us what to eat. And what happened? We increased the number of calories that we took in. Virtually all of those calories came from carbohydrate. We decreased the amount of saturated fat in our diet, just like they told us to. And we all got healthy, right? The impact on our health has not been what was intended. These are the unintended consequences. Prevalence of coronary heart disease has gone up. Prevalence of heart failure has spiked. Stroke has gone up. Incidence of cancer, all sites, has gone up. You're familiar already with this obesity and overweight graph. So we went, it's essentially doubled in the population. Probably the most alarming one is this one. Diabetes has tripled. And you can see a little bit of a lag between when the first goals were created and the guidelines were created, and the rise in diabetes. This is well, we no longer call it adult onset diabetes because kids get it. This is type 2 diabetes. It's the kind where what is happening is, so the obesity curve is right here. Obesity is not in and of itself a disease. It's a symptom for some folks of something going wrong with their metabolism. And that something going wrong is usually insulin resistance. So if you eat more carbohydrates than your body can handle, your pancreas is pumping out insulin like crazy, trying to keep that blood glucose under control. And what it's doing with those extra carbohydrate calories is stuffing them away in cells for storage. It's keeping your body from releasing any more fat, because it doesn't make any sense to store fat and release it at the same time. And so you get obesity. Meanwhile, your pancreas is pumping out insulin, pumping out insulin, pumping out insulin, and after about a decade, it goes, I give up. I just give up. And that's when your blood sugar starts to go up, and that's when you get diagnosed with diabetes. This is a pattern that hits close to home. Diabetes runs in my family. My dad was diagnosed with diabetes after changing his diet to get rid of saturated fat and animal products. My mom stopped feeding him salami and sausage and started feeding him fruit, lots of it. And he was diagnosed as pre-diabetic. And as a dietitian, I've seen what happens when people have diabetes and their toes turn black and fall off from bad circulation, and they're amputated and they end up on wound suction machines, and they're on dialysis, which is a long and painful process, and they lose their eyesight and they're confined to wheelchairs. And I could see that future for my dad, and I called up my dad and said, hey, how about you try a diet that's the opposite of the dietary guidelines? Get those animal products back in your diet. Get those carbohydrates out of there. And what happened? His blood sugars are normal, not diabetes normal. Normal like normal, my normal. He's had no progression of the disease. In fact, if you didn't look at his medical health records, you would never know the man was ever diagnosed with prediabetes. So it didn't just affect our health. It affected our farm economy as well. We told Americans to quit eating these less processed foods like whole milk, butter, beef, pork, and we told them to start eating more processed foods like cereals and flours and margarine. But what happens when you eat more processed foods is that a lot of that money goes to food manufacturers and not back to the farm. So these foods brought money back to the farm, and these foods brought money to the food manufacturers. As a result, since the creation of the dietary goals, farm share has plummeted, and then it's pretty much plateaued where it is today. So it also affected our farm economy, because the foods that made money for the farmers were the foods that they told us not to eat. How can they get away with this? Well, if you were paying attention to Peter, you know that's not the science. In fact, what they've been trying to do since 1977 is maintain this consistent public health message in the face of contradictory evidence. How do they do it? I'm going to show you how they do it. So here's the consistent public health message. Since 1977 to 2010, the dietary guidelines have changed virtually not at all. The prohibitions that they had against saturated fat and animal products that they had in 1977 are still there in 2010. Do you think science changed at all in the intervening time? Absolutely, that's what science does. But this is what policy does. The process that we have for creating the guidelines, first of all, was an afterthought, but the process itself is broken. So when the dietary guideline scientists get together to review the science, which is right here, that science is provided to them by the USDA and Department of Health and Human Services. And the agencies give the guidelines committee the science that they want the committee to see. It's not the full body of science. And so the conclusions that the committee come to are what the agencies want to have happen. And if they didn't, it doesn't matter anyway, because they can ignore the report and write what they want to for the policy document. And you can comment on what the work that the scientists do, but you can't comment on the work that the agencies do. You just get the guidelines that you get. And then the dietary guidelines are implemented through a vast number of federal programs. They affect school lunches. They affect lunches that are given through, food that's given out through elder care programs. They affect what we can spend our women, infants, and children money on, especially at farmers markets. A vast array. In fact, every program that says anything or has anything to do with nutrition in the federal government has to follow the dietary guidelines. So I'm going to pull the curtain back a little bit further and show you how they work the science when they're creating dietary guidelines. So they ask questions. What is the effect of saturated fat intake on increased risk of cardiovascular disease? And spoiler alert here, here's the answer that they want to find. That we should reduce our intake of animal products to reduce our intake of saturated fat. So how are we going to get the science to say what we want it to say? Because that's how policy and science interact. We're going to try and get this science to say what we want it to say. So here's the studies that they looked at. The pink studies are the good quality ones. The brown studies are the bad quality ones. It doesn't matter because they treat them all the same. And then they break the rules. So one of their rules was any study that has a more than 20% dropout rate in the experimental trial, we have to get rid of. These 4 studies had greater than 20% dropout rate. They're still reviewing them. So let's toss those out. They said don't use any studies that don't have changes in saturated fat levels. Well, in the Furtado study, both arms of the experimental trial had the same amount of saturated fat in the trial. So let's throw that out for them. In this study, they didn't look at the normal population, which is who the dietary guidelines are for. They looked at a population that had a disease called hypercholesterolemia. So let's throw that out for them. In this study, the conclusion of the study was saturated fat doesn't have any effect on cardiovascular risk markers. Well, that's not what the conclusion said. So I guess they just ignored this study. So we'll throw that out too. These 4 studies showed that when you change the saturated fat in people's diet, some risk factor markers went up, but others went down. So the net result was neutral. So that doesn't support our conclusion. Well, you've got to ignore that. So this was the only study of the studies that they looked at that actually supported the conclusion. This was an observational study, and this was its conclusion, that if you are a woman and you're under the age of 60, that saturated fat in your diet might have some relationship to heart disease. So if you're a woman in here and you're under 60, you think, oh, well, I might need to stay away from animal products. I'll switch over to olive oil, because that's better for you, right? Well, this study also showed that olive oil is associated with increased risk of heart disease. So you can take that as you wish. What it really shows is that observational studies are bad studies. So here's your strong evidence that saturated fat causes heart disease. This is from the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee work itself. This is why we have policy that's not based on science. When you look at a body that reviews the evidence that's not trying to come up with an answer that they've already decided on, the Cochrane review folks, they looked at all the clinical trials that there were to look at, not just a special selection. They didn't just keep in ones that didn't fit the criteria. So in their systematic review, they found out that saturated fat, in fact, any change of fat in the diet, doesn't have any effect on mortality, heart disease mortality, heart attack, stroke, cancer, diabetes. There's no relationship between saturated fat in the diet and these diseases. So how do we end up with these headlines that say red meat causes cancer and diabetes and heart disease and bad manners and foot odor? Well, it takes nutrition epidemiology to do that. And when you take a closer look at nutrition epidemiology, well, I like to say it's such a soft science. It's like the Jell-O of sciences. You pick it up and it just falls through your fingers. But we have this guy to thank, Walter Willett. He's the father of nutrition epidemiology. I like to call him the godfather of nutrition epidemiology, because he created a couple of data sets back in the late 70s, early 80s, using 2 specific populations of health professionals. And my husband, who thinks he's a funny guy, likes to say that nutrition epidemiology studies are strongly associated with a rise in obesity. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. Walter Willett and his gang started out with a data set here when our obesity levels were low, and they just churned out article after article after article after article, all telling us the same thing, that red meat is going to kill us. So how did they come to this conclusion? Well, I'm here to tell you how nutrition epidemiology works. Yeah, I spent a lot of time in a graduate program figuring it out, and if I'd only known, it's all the same conclusion. Every nutrition epidemiology study you ever look at, if you get that magnifying glass and you look up close, it tells you the same thing. People who care about their health are healthier than people who don't care about their health. Surprise, surprise. I call it, in nutrition epidemiology, we call it the healthy adherer effect or the placebo effect. I call it the pink bow tie effect, and it works like this. So I am a registered dietitian, so I'm going to tell you how you can protect yourself from chronic disease. Here it is. Here's a secret. Watch your weight. So maintain a healthy weight. If you smoke, cut back. If you don't smoke, don't start. If you drink, don't drink too much. If you don't like vegetables, take a multivitamin. Be active. Call your mother on Mother's Day. Go to your checkups. And wear a pink bow tie every day. And then you'll be fine. And there's some folks in the audience that are going to go, okay, I'll do it. I don't like pink or bow ties, but I'll do it. And you'll follow those rules that I gave you. And you'll wear your pink bow tie, and you'll watch your weight, and you won't smoke or drink too much, and you'll call your mother on Mother's Day. And you'll be healthier. Is it because of the pink bow tie? Probably not. And some of you in the audience are going, the hell with that. I'm not wearing a pink bow tie. And I'm going to smoke what I want to, I'm going to drink what I want to, and I love my mom, but if I don't call her on Mother's Day, well, hey. And you're not going to follow the rules. And are you going to be healthier? Probably not. That's what every nutrition epidemiology study shows, period. That's it. That's the secret. So when you see those headlines that say that, red meat gives you toe fungus, you can look at the population and you can see that the population that has toe fungus was a population that cared less about their health and performed less of those health rules than the population that didn't. Bottom line. And we've done a study of epidemiology studies. And what we do with epidemiology studies and what epidemiology studies actually say are very far apart. So, you know what epidemiology studies say? They say that specific populations may have some possible association with some health behaviors and some health outcomes. And then they take these conclusions and they say, well, it's just an observational study, but we can take this association and we can talk about it as if it's cause and effect. And it's just as an association, but we can talk about it as if it should be policy. And it's just a specific population, but we can talk about it as if it's everybody. And this is what we do with nutrition and obesity studies. And this is how they become policy that doesn't match science. So you may have heard other reasons why Americans are fat or sick. And I'm just going to briefly go through these. These are the other reasons because we don't want to blame the guidelines. This is what I found out at UNC. Anything but the guidelines. So we like to blame the fact that we no longer walk everywhere. Americans started driving and we all got fat. Well, we started driving after the Depression when we all started getting cars, but we didn't get fat back in the 20s. People like to say it's because we all took up desk jobs and started working behind computers. Well, that happened long before the guidelines came out. In fact, that switch from primarily labor jobs to primarily desk jobs happened about 20 years before the guidelines, but we weren't fat then. Some people like to blame mom. We all like to blame mom, right? It's mom's fault. Mom went back to work, left us all laying in front of the television, eating TV dinners, and that's how we got fat. Well, mom went back to work in the 50s, but we didn't get fat. It's because mom went back to work and we have to eat out. And there's all these McDonald's and all these Bojangles, and we eat at them, and that's why we're fat. Well, we started eating out way back in the 1950s, again with the prosperity after World War II. But we didn't get fat then. Television sets, we had those in the 60s. We only had 3 channels, but I don't know about you, but I watched just as much TV when I was a kid as my kids do. Probably more because I chase my kids away from the television set. But we weren't fat then. What about exercise? I hear this one a lot. It's because we don't exercise. Well, we don't have a lot of good baseline data, but what we know is that about 65% of the population actually gets as much exercise as is recommended. So the vast majority of us get as much exercise as is recommended by the dietary guidelines. And if you want some baseline data, think about this. How many gyms were there in your hometown when you were growing up in the 70s? How many pairs of athletic shoes did your mom and dad own? How many joggers were there in your neighborhood? I remember the very first jogger I ever saw. She came across our road in our neighborhood. My brothers and sisters and I had our face plastered up against the front window going, what is she doing? She doesn't even have a dog. She's just running. Is someone chasing her? And my mom was like, get back out of there. But every time she came by, she'd come by once every morning. We'd all run to the front window to watch this strange behavior. So another reason is that food got cheap. So food got cheap, so we ate more of it, which makes 0 sense from an economic standpoint. We know that the price of food is relatively inelastic. When food gets cheap, people might eat better quality food, but they don't eat more of it. You eat as much as you need. But what did happen is that as we ate the food that the dietary guidelines told us to eat, it was cheaper food. Cereal is cheaper than steak. What's the most expensive thing in the grocery store right now? Beef, meat. Meat is expensive. So what happened was, not that we ate more food because it was cheap, but because we started eating cheap food, we ate more of it. Now, why would we do that? Does anybody have an explanation why we would eat more food if it's cheap food?
That's nutritional value.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. I learned this from the guys in the van too, that cows apparently do the same thing. If you reduce the amount of protein in their feed, they eat more food until they get the amount of protein that they need. And if you increase the amount of protein, Johnny was explaining this to me last night, I thought it was fascinating, they actually won't eat enough and they won't get fat. So when we told people to quit eating meat and eggs, what happened? We started eating cereal. And how much protein is there in cereal? So did we have to eat more of it? We did, and we did. So food got cheap, and we ate that food, but we had to eat more of it because it was cheap food. So what lessons have we learned? The first lesson is this. So this is a headline, recent headline, high fiber diet linked to lower risk of death. All right, folks, and I hope I'm not shattering any illusions here, but what's your risk of death? 100%, not 99.9, but 100%. There is no food in the world that lowers your risk of death. Conversely, there's no food in the world that increases your risk of death. It's 100% all the time, beginning to end. When you see headlines like this, these are epidemiologists playing games with numbers. And I think this is the best explanation for that there is. Computation of risk is only valid for studies in which a causal relationship has already been established. And in how many nutrition epidemiology studies has a causal relation been established? 0. It's the exact opposite of your risk of death. So it's easy to remember. You don't have to worry about foods that cause a higher risk of death unless we already know that those foods are dangerous in a causal pattern. The other object lesson for you as producers is that you have to be careful what you wish for. When we were told to get the fat out of our foods, the pork producers went, okay, we can do that. We can get the fat out of our pork chops. And how did consumers feel about that? They didn't like it. And what happened? Well, we had to put the fat back in. And we put in all this gooey stuff, and the consumers didn't like that either. So you don't want to fall into that same trap. And then the final object lesson, and this is the one that I hope produces at least a little bit of outrage. This is from the December 15th DGAC meeting, and it says that the US population should consume dietary patterns that are rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, fish, seafood, legumes, and nuts. Meat is not mentioned at all. It says we should have moderate dairy products and alcohol, okay, and lower in red and processed meat. So that means that the DGAC thinks that alcohol is safer for you to eat than red meat. So if you got some kids at home, you give them a beer instead of a burger, all right, according to the DGAC. So what should you do? Like Peter said, talk to the people in charge. Let them know that you're unhappy with these guidelines. Spread the word. And defend your product. It's healthy. It's good for you. It always has been. People like beef. We just need to give them a reason to eat it. So let's give them the beef. Let's spare them the guilt. Thank you.
We've got some time for questions, and I will mention, yesterday we had a representative from Senator Warner's office at the meeting in Abington, and I did sick the crowd on it during the break.
I thought I sick the crowd on him.
So it's important to advocate for your project. And if you look at the new guidelines, I mean, beef is being, red meat is being reduced in these guidelines. If you don't think that's right, make sure you advocate for your product. Any questions for Adele? Got one right there?
One of the most common things you hear when you start advocating this sort of diet, more red meat, is they argue the calories in, calories out. You can eat a bowl of salad this big, same amount of calories for a little piece of steak. What is your argument to that?
Okay, the question is calories in, calories out. You can eat a giant bowl of salad, or you can eat a little bit of meat. So you eat a giant bowl of salad, what have you given your body? You've given it some fiber and some water, neither of which your body recognizes as nutrition. The water, you know what happens to that. The fiber, you know what happens to that, right? You eat that giant bowl of salad, and unless you put some meat, cheese, and eggs on it, which I highly recommend, you're going to be hungry again in about an hour, if not sooner. The calories in, calories out is another part of the myth. It really is. It matters what we eat. And in fact, I have one more slide that actually sort of addresses that. Your body, just like your animals' bodies, prioritizes calories. All calories are not equal. Your body prioritizes nutrition, and so should you. This is the only dietary advice I give. JB tried to weasel some more dietary advice out of me last night, but this is as far as I go. Prioritize your plate. You should eat your protein foods first. When you think about sitting down to eat, think, where's my protein? Like the Wendy's lady used to say, where's the beef? You get that first because that's what your body needs most. That's your first priority. I mean, when you feed your animals, are there not priorities? You just feed, they just need calories. Or I'll just give them some calories. Well, humans are no different. We need protein. That's what you prioritize. Colorful vegetables provide vitamins and minerals. So that's your second priority. That last category, starches and sugars, they're just not a priority. And if you found yourself squirming and getting uncomfortable when Peter was going through those metabolic syndrome criteria, that's the category that you don't need. Although I have to say, my favorite story about this last category, I was talking in Covington, I think, at the American Forage and Grassland Council. I was talking to Peggy Baldwin after the meeting, and she said, and I asked everybody, what do you have for breakfast? She says, well, I have my eggs, maybe a little piece of ham or sausage, and I have my whole wheat toast. And I said, well, why the toast? And I was expecting to hear, well, because I have to get my whole grains, because they're good for you, or I have to get my fiber. That's not what she said. She said, I need my toast to get my eggs on my fork. So I'm here to tell you, if you need that last little category to get your eggs on your fork, by all means, keep those in your diet. And that's all the nutrition you really need to know. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, one comment I want to make is, I thought the global warming and the green energy was the biggest hoax I'd ever heard of, but you proved that's the worst hoax it is.
And
The green energy may hurt my pocketbook and ethanol, but that right there is killing.
it is killing people. And I have to say that being a dietitian who's been in hospitals and seen the damage, especially from diabetes, it is heartbreaking. And it really bothers me, and I feel really bad about the fact that as a person who learned what was really going on from my biochemistry classes and from just knowing about how human nutrition really works, I could give my dad the right advice. But there are sons and daughters and wives and husbands all over America watching their family members die from diabetes piece by piece, literally piece by piece. And it breaks my heart. And the only reason we don't give these people the right diet is because we don't want them eating animal products, because we don't know why. There's no good reason.
What would be your approach to change this philosophy?
So he asked, what was my approach to change the philosophy? Well, when I'm not...
Heard what you did with your dad, but
How are we going to change it across the country? Well, we're working on it. That's the very fact that you folks have brought me here to have this conversation, this wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. So this is where it begins, with having the conversation and people educating themselves and learning about what's going on. The other thing is to raise a stink. The squeaky wheel really does get the grease. So people ask me, what do we do about skim milk in lunchrooms? Well, if you've never complained about it to the people who run your local lunchrooms, they don't know that you have a problem with it. So complain. Do some complaining. And in the meantime, we are doing some advocating up in Washington. I mean, I'm a grad student. I'm busy, but I do as much as I can to just get the word out, talk to people, write, get in front of various groups. The balance is tipping, so hang in there. Yeah.
I also am a registered dietitian, but I think we're, and that balance is tipping, perfect segue. Low carb, all these foods that are being sold as low carb, and I think subliminally people don't even really know why those products and that diet, so the shift is already occurring. We just need to give a big push.
And
on the verge.
Yes, it is on the verge. And the reality is, the more that the dietary guidelines overreach, I mean, when they get to the point where they're telling people not to eat meat at all, that's going to outrage some people, and that's going to cause the balance to really tip. So if they push their luck much further, I think they're going to have a revolution on their hands. Yes, sir.
I was reading an article not too long ago about vegetarians. I don't remember the exact figure. There was a percentage of vegetarians that was gradually going back to putting meats in their diet.
So he asked about vegetarians going back to putting meat in their diet. The data on vegetarians is very interesting. So our best data is that the self-reported vegetarian population is 2 to 3% of the population. So they are a vocal minority. But the other funny part about that is that when you look a little closer at these people who call themselves vegetarian, they usually eat meat at least once a week. And one of my favorite things that we found out about vegetarian is that people like to call themselves vegetarians. They don't actually like to be vegetarians. So yeah, but the dietary guidelines does accept a vegan diet as a perfectly healthy diet. And 30 years ago, before the dietary guidelines were created, a vegan diet was considered a dangerous fad. So that tells you how much a vocal minority can influence policy outcomes, especially when they meet the same priorities as that of giant corporations.
When are they going to change the guidelines for the school children then, that they got to where they are?
So when are they going to change the guideline for school children? They have to change the federal guidelines first. So the DGAs actually have to change first because that's what we base school policy, the school lunch program on. But again, if you complain, then the complaints trickle up. But as long as nobody's complaining, nobody knows that there's a problem. So what Peter and I do to a large extent is complain as loudly as we can and as front of many people as we can. And we get closer and closer to Washington all the time. Any other questions?
All right.
Thank you.
Let's thank Adele for that wonderful presentation.